Welcome back to M's Language Academy. I'm M, and today I want to talk about gradable and non-gradable adjectives. To start off, I'm going to show you a couple of sentences, and I want you to try and decide which of these sentences contain mistakes. Here they are. Have a good look at them, feel free to stop the video and come back when you've got an answer. Alright, it was a bit of a trick question because each of these sentences contains a mistake. Now these mistakes have to do with gradable and non-gradable adjectives. What on earth is that, you ask? Well, let's find out. We divide adjectives into two categories, gradable and non-gradable. Gradable adjectives, as the name suggests, can be graded. It means the quality they express can be graded, and we can have different levels of that quality. They are words such as cold, hot, expensive, cheap, tired, funny, angry, comfortable, and so on. There are quite a few of them, so I can't possibly name them all. The important thing to remember is that to modify these adjectives, we use words such as slightly, a bit, a little, somewhat, very, extremely, or some less common modifiers, rather, dreadfully, immensely, painfully, bitterly, highly, terribly, reasonably, most. So for example, you could be slightly cold, or a bit cold, or a little cold. Something can be somewhat expensive, or very expensive, or extremely expensive. You could be painfully tired. You could be immensely angry. You could be bitterly disappointed. Something could be reasonably interesting, and so on. Now, non-gradable adjectives cannot be graded. And there are three kinds of non-gradable adjectives. Ones that express an extreme quality. It means they already contain the idea of very. For example, amazing is very good. Horrible is very bad. Delicious is very tasty. Ridiculous is very silly. Hilarious is very funny. Tiny is very small, and so on. The second kind are adjectives that express an absolute quality. It means you either are that or you're not. For example, acceptable, alive, dead, free, destroyed. Something is either destroyed or it's not. You're either alive or you're dead. Something is either possible or impossible. Something is either perfect or not. Something either is necessary or it isn't. Right? Something is either right or wrong. There's no in between. You cannot be slightly alive. You cannot be extremely dead. You're dead, and that's the end of it, right? The third category, the third kind, are classifying adjectives. Words such as nuclear, wooden, domestic, chemical, digital, and so on. They represent a certain class of objects, and it doesn't really make logical sense to grade these things, to grade these adjectives. But in general, with non-gradable adjectives, we use a different set of modifiers, and they are absolutely, totally, completely. Those are the most common ones, but you can also have utterly, nearly, virtually, essentially, mainly, almost, positively, simply, right? So things can be absolutely horrible, totally ridiculous, completely wrong, utterly disgusting, virtually non-existent, and so on and so forth. Now, why is it important to learn about these things? There are two kinds of mistakes, right? So when it comes to gradable and non-gradable adjectives, most textbooks and grammar resources say that non-gradable adjectives do not usually form comparatives or superlatives. This rule is not really set in stone, and you will often hear native speakers breaking it. Here, I don't think this will really cause a lot of trouble because you can sort of logically figure out when it's okay to form a comparative or a superlative and when it isn't. For example, in a sentence, your weapons may be nuclear, but our weapons are even more nuclear. What does that mean, right? That doesn't have a clear meaning. Or, she's dead, but he's even more dead. What does that really mean? It's very difficult to imagine what such a sentence could mean. However, people say things like, I've never felt more alive in my life. Or, this is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. While technically we shouldn't say things like that, they have a clear, understandable meaning, and no one will be confused. No one will look at you strangely if you say them, because native speakers say them all the time. The more serious mistakes, which many non-native speakers make, have to do with using the correct set of modifiers. And again, these are soft rules. So native speakers do break them as well, very often. But here I would say that certain combinations sound worse than others, right? So as the rules stand, we cannot use words such as a bit, a little, very with non-gradable adjectives. So technically, we shouldn't say things like very delicious, slightly ridiculous, somewhat destroyed. And the other way around, we cannot use, or we shouldn't use, words such as absolutely, completely, totally to modify gradable adjectives. So we shouldn't say we are absolutely tired, something is completely expensive. In my opinion, however, certain combinations sound far worse than others. For example, you might hear native speakers say that the cake is very delicious, and no one will even bang an eye. But we shouldn't say things like, it was slightly destroyed. This was very horrible, completely expensive, and so on. This will sound very wrong. Or should I say totally wrong? Let me know in the comments. Now, how to decide whether an adjective is gradable or non-gradable. It's not a good idea to learn a list of gradable and non-gradable adjectives, because I imagine that the list would be quite long, would be very long, would be extremely long. But there are certain strategies that can help you. Number one, you need to ask yourself, or you can ask yourselves these questions. Number one, does the word express a quality that can be graded? So cold, does it make sense that it's a bit cold, very cold, extremely cold? If the answer to that question is yes, then it's a gradable adjective. Or does the adjective express the idea of very? Does it have an extreme quality, like delicious, exhausted? Delicious is very tasty. Exhausted, very tired. Or does it have an absolute quality, destroyed, or frozen, or dead, or perfect? Perfect is an absolute quality, right? You cannot go higher than that. So if the answer to either of these is yes, then they are non-gradable adjectives. And the final question you can ask, does it express just simply a class of objects? Is it like wooden? If the answer to this question is yes, then you probably won't be adding anything to it at all, unless you're making a metaphor. He went totally ballistic. All right, if this doesn't help, you can also try to say a few modifiers with an adjective and see what sort of feels better. Cold, very cold, or absolutely cold? Very cold sounds better. What's absolutely cold? I have a hard time imagining absolutely cold. A little exhausted or absolutely exhausted? I'm a little exhausted. I'm absolutely exhausted. Absolutely exhausted sounds much better. Very horrible or absolutely horrible? Very horrible. Absolutely horrible. Absolutely horrible sounds much better. But if all of this fails, do not despair, because there are certain modifiers, thank God there are certain modifiers, that can be used with both gradable and non-gradable adjectives. If you can't decide whether an adjective is gradable or non-gradable, you can just use so, fairly, pretty, really, or quite. Really, you probably know that really is stronger than pretty or fairly. So it can be pretty cold outside, or you could be pretty exhausted. Something could be really bad or really horrible. Quite, it can also be used with both gradable and non-gradable adjectives, but the problem is that the meaning changes. I'm going to cover quite more extensively in one of my future videos, but for now, suffice it to say that with gradable adjectives, quite means fairly. So if it's quite cold, it's fairly cold. But if something is quite horrible, it's absolutely horrible. So you have to be careful with that one. So now that we know all this theory, let's do a bit of practice. Let's go back to the sentences that I showed you at the beginning of the video. And let's see why those sentences contain mistakes and how to fix them. Number one, we were completely tired when the shift ended. Tired is a gradable adjective, so we shouldn't use completely. We can say we were very tired, we were extremely tired, we were really tired even when the shift ended. What you're saying sounds a bit ridiculous. Ridiculous means very silly. It is a non-gradable adjective, so we cannot say a bit ridiculous. Something either is ridiculous or it isn't. So you either don't use a modifier, or you can say what you're saying sounds absolutely ridiculous. Sounds pretty ridiculous. Using a laptop without a keyboard is absolutely uncomfortable. Again, uncomfortable, gradable adjective, absolutely is not a good fit. It could be a bit uncomfortable, it could be somewhat uncomfortable, it could be very uncomfortable, it could be dreadfully uncomfortable, it could be painfully uncomfortable, it could be most uncomfortable. The cake is very delicious. This is a very common one, very common one. So if you say this, I think it will sort of slip under most people's radar, but still, technically we shouldn't say it, so we should say it's quite delicious. It's absolutely delicious. It's positively delicious. Or the cake is simply delicious. I'm a bit exhausted. Again, exhausted means very tired. So it's a non-gradable adjective, and we cannot use a bit. You either are exhausted or you're not, but you can be totally exhausted. You can be completely, utterly exhausted. Nearly exhausted you can be also, but certainly not a bit exhausted. We were slightly disgusted by what we saw. It's a non-gradable adjective. So again, we shouldn't say slightly disgusted, but we can say that we were totally disgusted. We were utterly disgusted. We were positively disgusted by what we saw. And now the last bit is a test. Here are some sentences, and I would like you to decide which modifier is more appropriate. We were very or absolutely surprised by his behavior. Surprised is a gradable adjective. We can say we were very surprised by his behavior. Number two, his behavior was a bit shocking or positively shocking. Shocking, shocking. What do you think? Is shocking a gradable or a non-gradable adjective? The answer is, it is a non-gradable adjective. If we think about it, surprising and shocking, they sort of form a pair. Surprising, shocking. Surprising is gradable, shocking is non-gradable. Therefore, we should say that it was positively shocking. His behavior was positively shocking. She looks very pretty in her new dress, or she looks absolutely pretty in her new dress. So what do you think? Is pretty a gradable or a non-gradable adjective? The answer is gradable. Very pretty. If we look at sentence 4, we can see a different adjective there. Beautiful. Again, if you think about it, pretty versus beautiful. They form a pair because beautiful means very pretty. So you can say something is very pretty or it's absolutely beautiful. Beautiful is a non-gradable adjective. Pretty and beautiful sort of form a pair. There are many pairs of these gradable and non-gradable adjectives. All right, number 5. What they did to the dog was very horrible or utterly horrible. I think you already know the answer to this one. Horrible is definitely a non-gradable adjective, and therefore we have to say utterly horrible. I need to charge my phone. It's slightly dead or it's totally dead. I think this one's easy. The answer is totally dead. The twins are very identical or virtually identical. Identical is a non-gradable adjective. Two things either are identical or they're not. Okay? Definitely we have to use virtually identical. The film was very or totally scary. 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 What do you think? Scary is a gradable adjective. It's non-gradable. Its non-gradable counterpart could be, for example, terrifying, horrifying. So something could be absolutely terrifying, but very scary is what we would normally say. The city was extremely destroyed or completely destroyed by the bombing. Destroyed, something either is destroyed or it's not. Okay, you cannot be a little bit destroyed. Non-gradable adjective, completely destroyed. The hotel was a bit or completely cheap. So it wasn't very nice or totally nice. Here we have two adjectives. So cheap is a gradable adjective, so a bit cheap sounds okay, but it wasn't very nice or totally nice. Nice is also gradable. The correct answer is the hotel was a bit cheap, so it wasn't very nice. And the last one, number 11, this one gave me a run for my money because for the love of me, I could not decide whether lovely was gradable or non-gradable. So in this one, if I had to say lovely without doing any research, I would probably go for really, to be honest. I went on holiday and it was very lovely or absolutely lovely. And I researched it and I couldn't find a good answer. I asked ChatGPT, gave me 3 different answers, but then I found out in the end that it was a lot of work. Very lovely or absolutely lovely, what do you think? Turns out lovely is a non-gradable adjective, and we should say absolutely lovely. So that's it for the video today. I hope you found it useful or interesting / entertaining. If so, don't forget to like the video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to my channel. If you thought it was a waste of time, please let me know in the comments. I'll see you soon. In the meantime, remember that you don't have to be absolutely perfect, but you can always be a bit better. Bye.